Before we begin this story of betrayal, secret ownership, and carefully orchestrated justice, I want to thank each of you for being part of this journey. Every story we share highlights the power of strategic thinking and quiet strength in the face of deception. Today's account reveals how careful planning and financial foresight turned the tables on a husband who thought he held all the cards, only to discover too late that his wife had been the power behind his success all along. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Savannah, we need to finalize the Stevens contract this week, my husband Blake reminded me as he poured his morning coffee into the travel mug I'd gifted him for our 10th anniversary last year. He was dressed impeccably, as always, tailored. Navy suit, crisp white shirt, the Patek Philippe watch that had been my gift when Morgan Stanley had finally made him managing director 3 years ago. Already handled, I replied, not looking up from my laptop where I was reviewing quarterly projections for Westlake Innovations, the tech consulting firm Blake had built from the ground up, or rather, the firm he believed he had built from the ground up. Preston called yesterday. They've agreed to all our terms, including the extended maintenance package. The paperwork should arrive today. Blake smiled, that perfect white-toothed smile that had first caught my attention when we met at Northwestern's business school 15 years ago. This is why we're the perfect team. Perfect team. If only he knew. From the outside, our life seemed like a well-curated success story. Blake Thompson, charismatic founder and CEO of Westlake Innovations, and his supportive wife Savannah, who'd put her own MBA to use managing their household, their social calendar, and occasionally offering business insights when asked. Our Tudor-style home in Chicago's North Shore neighborhood, our membership at the Lakeview Country Club, our annual trips to Aspen and the Amalfi Coast, all carefully selected pieces of a life that looked enviable from the outside. What Blake didn't know, what he had never bothered to investigate, was that Westlake Innovations wasn't actually his company. It was mine. My grandfather had been an early investor in Microsoft, and my parents had continued his tradition of smart technology investments. By the time I graduated from business school, I had a trust fund that most people could only dream of. But I had watched too many of my female relatives become decorative accessories in their husbands' lives, their own ambitions and intelligence, relegated to planning charity galas and selecting window treatments. I wanted something different. I wanted to build something. And when I met Blake, brilliant, ambitious, but completely without capital or connections, I saw my opportunity. I believe in you, I had told him when he first shared his vision for Westlake. Let me help, he thought. I meant emotional support, maybe some networking introductions. What I actually provided was $2.4 million in seed funding, channeled through a series of investment vehicles and holding companies that my family's financial advisors had established. The ownership structure was complex by design. Thompson Technology Partners owned 51% of Westlake Innovations, while Blake directly owned 49%. What he never investigated was that I owned 100% of Thompson Technology Partners through my family's Callaway Holdings Group. He signed the papers without reading the fine print. Men like Blake rarely do. They're too confident, too assured that the world exists to serve their ambitions. His name was on the letterhead, his face in the promotional materials. That was enough for him. For 12 years, I had been content with this arrangement. I genuinely loved Blake, or at least the Blake I thought I knew. I took satisfaction in watching him succeed with my capital, my connections, and more of my strategic guidance than he ever realized. The company had grown from a struggling 3-person operation to a respected firm with 87 employees, an annual revenue exceeding $22 million. Blake's success fed his confidence, and his confidence won us clients. It was a profitable partnership. I sipped my tea, watching him check his reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting his already perfect tie. "The Harrison meeting is at 2, I reminded him. Don't let Jackson monopolize the conversation like last time. The Harrisons respond. Better to Melissa's approach. Blake nodded absently, his attention already elsewhere. I'll be home late tonight. Strategy dinner with the Phoenix clients. The Burnham Group? I asked, though I already knew they weren't on the calendar. Should I join you? James Burnham mentioned wanting my input on their donor management software when we saw them at the benefit last month. A flicker of something crossed Blake's face. Annoyance? Panic? No need. It's just preliminary discussions. Very technical. Probably run late. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Of course. I have the hospital board meeting tonight anyway. He kissed my cheek, his lips barely making contact. You're the best, Sav. Don't know what I'd do without you. As the door closed behind him, I allowed myself a moment of stillness. 6 months ago, I would have believed him. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have noticed the slight stiffness in his shoulders when I offered to join the client for dinner. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have installed tracking software on his phone after finding the first suspicious text message. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have known about Amber Russell, the 28-year-old marketing director he'd hired last year, whose downtown apartment he visited at least 3 times a week, including tonight, when there was no strategy dinner with the non-existent Burnham Group. I closed my laptop and moved to the sunroom overlooking our meticulously landscaped backyard. The gardeners had planted the spring bulbs exactly as I'd specified, symmetrical bands of tulips and daffodils bordering the stone pathway. I appreciated the order, the careful planning that created something beautiful. I had always approached my life the same way, methodical, strategic, with contingencies for every scenario, including the scenario where my husband betrayed me. The first hint had been almost too subtle to notice. A new password on his personal phone. Blake had always been transparent with me before, no jealousy, no petty secrets. We knew each other's passwords, shared calendars, had access to each other's emails. It was practical for our busy lives. The new password could have been nothing, a security upgrade, a corporate policy change. But it coincided with late nights that became more frequent, client meetings that couldn't be verified, the faint scent of an unfamiliar perfume that was definitely not the Chanel I had worn for the past decade. I hadn't confronted him. That's not how women like me operate. Instead, I began cataloging discrepancies, collecting data points, the same way I would approach a potential investment or acquisition target. My first concrete confirmation came from our shared American Express statement. A $412 dinner at Rossetti's, a romantic Italian restaurant far from any of our corporate clients' offices, on a night Blake had claimed to be at a technology conference in Minneapolis. A $1,890 charge at Tiffany & Co. for a purchase that had never appeared among my possessions. Hotel charges billed to the company card but removed from the expense reports that crossed my desk. The pieces assembled themselves into an undeniable pattern. But still, I waited, observed, and collected more data. I had not built my fortune by acting impulsively. My phone chimed with a calendar alert. 10:00 a.m. meeting with Catherine Parker, my personal attorney. Blake thought Catherine was merely my friend from college, someone I occasionally met for lunch or tennis. He didn't know that Catherine was one of Chicago's most formidable divorce attorneys, with a reputation for surgical precision in high-net-worth cases. I wasn't ready to file yet, but I believed in preparation. In my home office, the small, elegantly appointed room that Blake dismissed as my hobby space, where I managed our social calendar and charity commitments, I opened the hidden safe behind a framed photograph of Blake and me in Positano. Inside was a USB drive containing everything I had documented about Blake's affair, copies of Westlake's corporate structure, and detailed financial records tracking every dollar of my investment into his company. I had been adding to this file for nearly 3 months, ever since the day my suspicions had crystallized into certainty. That day, I had been downtown for a lunch meeting with my financial advisor, Martin Walsh, when I spotted Blake entering an upscale jewelry store. Curious, I had waited across the street, watching as he emerged 40 minutes later with the distinctive light blue bag from Tiffany's. For a moment, I had felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps my suspicions were wrong. Perhaps he was planning a surprise for our anniversary the following month. That hope evaporated when I followed him 6 blocks to an apartment building in River North, where he was greeted at the door by a slim blonde woman who accepted the gift, with obvious delight before pulling him inside with a kiss that left no room for misinterpretation. Amber Russell. I had memorized her personnel file after that day. Stanford MBA. Previously at a boutique marketing firm in San Francisco. Impressive resume, exceptional references. Blake had personally championed her hiring, overriding our HR director's preference for a candidate with more relevant industry experience. Now I understand why. I drove to Catherine's downtown office, mentally reviewing my objectives for today's meeting. Catherine greeted me with a warm hug that belied her professional ferocity. "Savannah, always punctual," she said, gesturing to me in the seating area in her corner office with its view of Millennium Park. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I replied, settling into the leather armchair. "Just continuing to gather information." Catherine's expression was sympathetic but practical. We had known each other since our undergraduate days at Northwestern, long enough that she could see past my composed exterior. "The private investigator's report arrived this morning," she said, sliding a folder across the glass coffee table. "Everything is documented as we suspected. Times, dates, photographs. The affair has been ongoing for approximately 7 months based on electronic communications they've recovered." I nodded, not reaching for the folder. I didn't need to see the photographs. "And the financial assessment? A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off." Catherine switched seamlessly to the business aspects, knowing this was where I needed clarity. "Martin and I have completed the full analysis of Westlake's corporate structure. Your position is exactly as you thought, incontrovertible ownership. Through the holding companies. Blake would have no legal ground to claim otherwise, particularly given that all investment capital traced directly back to your family funds." She leaned forward slightly. "Savannah, when you decide to proceed, and I emphasize when, not if, he will be stunned. Men like Blake don't read the fine print. They assume ownership follows their name on the letterhead." "And the prenuptial agreement?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I had insisted on it before our marriage, presenting it as protection for Blake against my family's wealth. In reality, it had been my protection against exactly this scenario. "Rock solid," Catherine confirmed. "Furthermore, his infidelity provides grounds to trigger the morality clause. He would not be entitled to any portion of your assets acquired before or during the marriage." I absorbed this confirmation with a small nod. "And what about what he doesn't know about yet?" Catherine smiled thinly. "The Meridian acquisition? Completely separate from Westlake's current operations. Your ownership through Callaway Holdings is distinct and untouchable. The Meridian deal was my latest investment, a promising cybersecurity firm that would perfectly complement Westlake's services. Blake had been pursuing them for months without success. What he didn't know was that I had already acquired Meridian through my separate business entities, planning to integrate it with Westlake as an anniversary surprise. Now it would serve a different purpose. "I'm not ready to file yet," I said, meeting Catherine's gaze. "There are several strategic moves I need to make first. Corporate restructuring that will be simpler before divorce proceedings begin." Catherine nodded, professional respect evident in her expression. "Of course. But may I offer some personal advice, as your friend? Don't wait too long. Men having affairs eventually make mistakes. Either they become careless about covering their tracks, or they decide to leave. The advantage is currently yours because he doesn't realize you know. That advantage has an expiration date. I smiled for the first time that morning. I'm well aware, but Blake won't leave, not yet. He's waiting for something. The year-end. Bonuses? Catherine guessed. That, and the Morton contract. The Morton Technologies deal represented nearly $30 million in potential business, the largest in Westlake's history. Blake has tied his personal identity completely to Westlake's success. He won't walk away until he's secured that victory. His ego needs it. Catherine didn't argue. She had seen enough high-profile divorces to recognize the patterns of male hubris. Just be careful. These situations can escalate quickly. After leaving Catherine's office, I didn't return home immediately. Instead, I drove to a small cafe in Evanston, near Northwestern's campus. The location held no significance for Blake. We never came here together. That was precisely why I had chosen it for my monthly meetings with Dr. Elaine Summers. Officially, Elaine was Westlake's business strategy consultant, providing market analysis and growth projections. Her reports crossed Blake's desk regularly, though he rarely read past the executive summaries. What Blake didn't know was that Elaine had been my mother's closest friend for decades, and that her consulting role gave me perfect cover for regular strategy sessions about Westlake that remained completely off Blake's radar. Elaine was already waiting when I arrived, a pot of tea and 2 cups on the table. At 63, she combined the wisdom of a Harvard Business School professor emeritus with the practical experience of having served on the boards of multiple Fortune 500 companies. I saw the latest from Blake's development team, she said, after we'd exchanged greetings. The new healthcare vertical looks promising, but they're missing critical components for real market penetration. Components that Meridian could provide, I noted, adding honey to my tea. Elaine's eyes sparkled with understanding. Precisely. Have you decided when to reveal that particular chess move? Not yet. The timing needs to be strategic. I hesitated, then added, things at home are evolving. I may need to accelerate certain aspects of our planning. Elaine had known about Blake's affair for nearly as long as I had. Unlike others who might have urged immediate confrontation, she understood my methodical approach. The Morton contract? She asked. I nodded. Blake's scheduled to present the final proposal next week. Their CEO has practically guaranteed we'll get the business. And by we, you mean Westlake, which is actually you. Elaine's direct manner was one of the qualities I value most about her. Yes, which means the timing of any personal adjustments needs to be carefully considered. Elaine studied me for a moment. Savannah, I've known you since you were a teenager. You've always been 10 steps ahead of everyone else. What's your real concern here? I hadn't planned to share this part yet, but Elaine had an uncanny ability to see past my carefully constructed facades. Blake's been meeting with venture capitalists, I said quietly. 3 meetings in the past month with Redwood Partners. He's exploring a partial sale of Westlake, a sale he has no authority to execute. But they don't know that. Elaine's eyebrows rose. That's bold, even for him. What's his play? I believe he wants liquidity. The affair with Amber has progressed. Based on their text exchanges, they've discussed leaving their respective situations. She's divorced, but he needs an exit strategy that leaves him financially secure. I sipped my tea, my hand perfectly steady despite the anger I felt whenever I thought about their messages. He's looking to cash out a portion of his company without my knowledge, while maintaining operational control, Elaine concluded. Classic, and completely impossible given the actual ownership structure. Yes, but he doesn't know that I know about these meetings. Just as he doesn't know that I had lunch with Sarah Jenkins at Redwood last week. Elaine's surprise showed for a brief moment before she laughed softly. Of course you did. Sarah was 2 years behind you at Northwestern, wasn't she? Yes. We've kept in touch. She was quite interested to learn about Blake's approach to their firm, particularly since he presented himself as the majority owner with unilateral decision-making authority. How did you explain your knowledge without revealing your hand? I presented it as a concern from a supportive wife who oversees the family finances. I suggested that before they proceed, they might want to request full documentation of Westlake's capitalization table and corporate structure. I allowed myself a small smile. Sarah assured me they would exercise thorough due diligence. Elaine nodded approvingly. So when they request the full documentation, the house of cards begins to collapse, I finished. But I need to time this carefully. If Blake realizes too soon that his fundraising efforts have hit a wall, he might take more desperate measures. We spent the next hour discussing various scenarios and contingencies. Elaine had always been my most valuable sounding board, someone who understands both business strategy and human psychology. By the time we parted, I had refined my approach for the coming weeks. As I drove home, I reflected on the path forward. I had built my life on careful planning and strategic patience. Those same qualities would now guide me through its dismantling and reconstruction. Blake's betrayal had hurt. I wouldn't pretend otherwise. But beneath the personal pain was a cold, clear certainty. He had underestimated me in the most fundamental way possible. He had mistaken my support for subordination, my partnership for servitude. And now he would learn what happened when a man built his empire on someone else's foundation, and then tried to claim it as solely his own. I arrived home with just enough time to prepare for the hospital board meeting. As I changed into an appropriate outfit, a conservative St. John knit suit in navy that conveyed both authority and philanthropic seriousness, my phone chimed with a text from Blake. Meeting ran long. "Don't wait up," I texted back immediately. "No problem. Good luck with the Burnham Group. The hospital gala committee wants to discuss the fall theme tonight, so I'll be late too." His response came seconds later. "You're the best, Sav." I set down my phone, a sense of calm purpose settling over me. Let him believe I remained oblivious. Let him continue constructing his elaborate fiction about business dinners and client meetings. Let him think the ground beneath his feet was solid. I knew better, and soon he would too. The following morning, I woke before Blake. This had become our new normal, me rising with the dawn, Blake sleeping later, claiming exhaustion from his dedicated work ethic. I slipped quietly from bed and completed my morning routine, 30 minutes on the Peloton, shower, then coffee on the terrace overlooking Lake Michigan. These solitary moments had become essential, giving me space to think without the performance of being Blake's adoring wife. The spring air carried a hint of warmth as I reviewed the quarterly financials for Westlake that had arrived in my private email last night. The numbers were excellent. Revenue up 22% year over year, margins improving steadily. Blake would be pleased when the official reports crossed his desk later today. He would attribute the success to his leadership, his vision. The thought no longer bothered me. Let him believe what he needed to believe, for now. My phone lit up with a text from Martin Walsh, my financial advisor. Redwood Partners requested full corporate structure documents this morning, timeline proceeding as expected. I smiled slightly. Blake would be furious when he discovered his potential investors conducting deeper due diligence than he'd anticipated. I texted back a simple, "Keep me informed of developments." When Blake finally emerged onto the terrace at 7:30, his hair still damp from the shower, I had transitioned fully into the role he expected. Supportive wife, morning newspaper folded precisely. To the business section, fresh coffee waiting in his preferred mug. "Morning," he mumbled, reaching for the coffee. "How was your hospital last night?" "Productive," I replied. "We've settled on midnight in Morocco for the fall gala theme. The committee thinks it will incentivize larger donations if we create an exotic experience." Blake nodded absently, his attention on his phone. "Makes sense. Sounds great. How was your dinner? Did the Burnham Group respond well to your proposal?" A barely perceptible pause. "Very well. We're moving forward with discussions." I kept my expression neutral. "Wonderful. Oh, and Preston from Stevens Corp called last night. They need the finalized contract by Friday instead of Monday. I told him that shouldn't be a problem. This captured Blake's attention. The Stevens contract was worth $3.8 million. Not our largest client, but significant enough to matter. Friday? That's pushing it with legal review. I already spoke with Terrence in legal. He can expedite if needed, but he thinks the contract is straightforward enough that there shouldn't be any issues. Blake's expression shifted subtly, a mixture of relief and something else. Irritation, perhaps, that I had already solved a problem before he could even process it. This had been our dynamic for years. Me quietly handling complications before they reached crisis level, him accepting the assistance while maintaining the fiction that he was ultimately in control. "Thanks," he said finally. "You always think of everything." "That's what partners do," I replied, maintaining eye contact for perhaps a second too long. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face before he glanced at his watch. "I should head in early, meeting with the executive team at 9. After Blake left, I called Laura Matthews, Westlake's chief financial officer. Laura had been my sorority sister at Northwestern and one of my first recruits when we expanded the company's leadership team 5 years ago. Blake believed he had discovered her at a finance conference, never realizing the chance meeting had been carefully orchestrated. "He's getting anxious," Laura reported after we exchanged pleasantries. "He's been reviewing the capital structure documents this week, something he never usually bothers with." "The Redwood Partners meetings," I confirmed. "Exactly. He asked me to prepare a presentation highlighting his founder equity and decision rights. I created something that sticks to the facts without revealing the full ownership structure." "Perfect. If he pushes further, I'll suggest he consult the corporate counsel for clarification on specifics. That would route him to Jerome, who knows to contact you immediately." Jerome Wilson had been my family's attorney for decades. He had structured the original investment vehicles that established my ownership of Westlake. Blake had met him only twice at corporate events where Jerome had presented himself as merely one of the company's outside counsel. "Thank you, Laura. And the Morton proposal? Is everything on track?" "Absolutely. Blake is presenting next Thursday. He's confident. Says he has a special approach that will seal the deal." I made a note on my calendar. "Keep me posted on any developments. And Laura, thank you for navigating this complicated situation." "Please," she replied with a short laugh. "After what he's doing, I'm happy to help make sure he gets exactly what he deserves." After ending the call, I drove to the private bank where I maintained a safe deposit box separate from our joint accounts. Blake knew about my family's main accounts with Northern Trust, managed by Martin. What he didn't know was that I maintained separate relationships with 3 other financial institutions, each with specific purposes in my overall financial architecture. First, Chicago Private Bank housed my most sensitive documents, the original corporate formation papers for Westlake, documentation of all capital investments I had made, and the trust structures that connected to my ownership of Thompson Technology Partners. These papers constituted irrefutable proof that Blake's company had always been mine. The bank manager greeted me by name as I entered. "Mrs. Thompson, always a pleasure. Your box is ready whenever you are." In the private viewing room, I carefully examined each document, confirming everything was in order. To these files, I added a USB drive containing the most recent communications between Blake and Redwood Partners, emails that my private investigator had obtained showing Blake representing himself as the company's controlling shareholder with full authority to negotiate a partial sale. As I finished organizing these materials, my phone rang with a call from an unexpected source. Rachel Davis, my neighbor and the wife of Blake's closest friend, Michael. "Savannah," Rachel said, her voice hesitant. "Do you have time for coffee today? There's something I think we should discuss." The careful phrasing sent a clear signal. In our social circle, unplanned coffee invitations with that particular tone generally preceded uncomfortable revelations, usually about infidelity. Rachel and I were friendly but not close confidants. For her to reach out this way meant something significant had changed. Of course, I replied smoothly. The usual place. At 11? Perfect, thank you. An hour later, I sat across from Rachel at Maple and Ash, an upscale cafe far enough from our neighborhood to minimize the chance of running into mutual acquaintances. Rachel looked nervous, turning her wedding ring around her finger repeatedly. I'm not sure how to say this, she began after our coffees arrived. Michael and I have always valued our friendship with you and Blake. You've been such a wonderful couple in our lives. Have been. Past tense. Interesting. I value our friendship too, I said gently, giving her space to continue. Rachel took a deep breath. Last week, Michael and Blake had drinks at the club. Michael came home, troubled. Blake had been drinking more than usual and started talking about changes he was planning to make. Personal changes? I kept my expression neutral, encouraging. Michael didn't want to get involved, but after thinking about it for days, he felt you should know. Rachel lowered her voice. Blake told Michael he's been unhappy for some time, that he's met someone who understands the real him in ways you supposedly don't. He said once the Morton contract is finalized and he secures some liquidity event for the company, he plans to ask for a divorce. I allowed an appropriate expression of shock to cross my face, followed by controlled hurt. Rachel reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I'm so sorry, Savannah. Michael wasn't sure if he should tell you, but I insisted. If it were me, I would want to know. Thank you, I said softly. This is unexpected. A lie, of course, but Rachel didn't need to know that I had been tracking Blake's affair for months or that I had already engaged one of Chicago's top divorce attorneys. Did Blake mention who this person is? I asked the expected question from a blindsided wife. Rachel hesitated. He didn't give a name, but Michael thinks it's someone from Westlake, a younger woman who joined recently. I see. I took a careful sip of my coffee. And the liquidity event? Did he elaborate? Rachel shook her head. Only that he was working on a deal that would give him independent wealth, regardless of what happens with the divorce. Michael got the impression Blake thinks he can cash out part of Westlake without it affecting the company's operations. That's ambitious, I replied, allowing a hint of my genuine feelings to show through. Savannah, if you need anything, support, a place to stay, someone to talk to, I'm here. We both are. I reached for her hand, giving it a grateful squeeze. Thank you, Rachel. This is all very fresh, but I appreciate knowing. And please thank Michael for me. I know that couldn't have been an easy position for him. After finishing our coffee and assuring Rachel that I would be all right, I drove to Westlake's downtown offices. I rarely visited the company headquarters, part of maintaining the fiction that I was merely the supportive spouse rather than the actual owner. But today's developments warranted an appearance. The gleaming glass tower on Michigan Avenue housed Westlake on 3 floors. Blake's corner office on the 42nd floor offered panoramic views of the lake and downtown. As I entered the reception area, the surprise on the receptionist's face was evident. Mrs. Thompson, we weren't expecting you today. Last-minute decision, I explained with a warm smile. Is Blake available? I was hoping to surprise him for lunch. I'm sorry, but Mr. Thompson is out of the office until 2. He has an external meeting, exactly as I had expected. According to the tracking app on his phone, Blake was currently at Amber's apartment, a Tuesday lunchtime rendezvous that had become part of his regular schedule. No problem at all. Is Laura available? I need to drop off some tax documents, and she offered to help coordinate with our accountant. Minutes later, I was seated in Laura's office with the door closed. I updated her on Rachel's revelation. So he's accelerated his timeline, Laura noted, her expression concerned. The Morton contract is still a week away. which means his discussions with Redwood must be progressing faster than we anticipated. I tapped my fingers lightly on the armrest, thinking. When is he planning to present the updated capital structure to them? Laura checked her calendar. Friday afternoon. He's asked me to prepare the final materials by tomorrow. We need to adjust our approach. Can you delay the preparation? Some technical issue with the financial systems, perhaps? Laura smiled slowly. Our secure server could certainly experience some unexpected maintenance issues. It might take until Monday to resolve. Perfect. That will push his Redwood meeting past the Morton presentation. Has he been reviewing the proposal for Morton? Obsessively. He's convinced this contract will cement his legacy. And it would have if Westlake were actually his company. I stood, smoothing my skirt. I should go before he returns. But first, I'd like to see Amber's office. Laura raised an eyebrow but nodded. Marketing is on 41. I'll walk you down. The marketing department occupied the northeast corner of the building. Through glass walls, I could see the creative team working on presentation materials. Laura led me past them to a private office, with Amber Russell, marketing director, on a sleek nameplate. She's at lunch, Laura noted with irony in her voice. As I'm sure you're aware. I glanced through the glass at Amber's workspace. Modern, minimalist, with a designer handbag casually placed on a side table. A framed photograph showed Amber at a company event standing next to Blake. Their body language was professional, but knowing what I knew now, I could detect the subtle signs of their connection. What do you make of her professionally? I asked. Laura. She's talented, Laura admitted reluctantly. Her campaigns have generated solid results. The team respects her work, if not her personal choices. So others know? Suspect, at least. Blake thinks they're discreet, but Laura shrugged. Office dynamics make secrets difficult to maintain. I nodded, filing this information away. Thank you, Laura. I should go. As I turned to leave, movement caught my eye. Amber and Blake, stepping off the elevator together. They maintained a professional distance, but their flushed faces and slightly disheveled appearance told the real story. I stepped back into the marketing department, momentarily hidden from view. What do you want to do? Laura whispered urgently. I considered my options quickly. Introduce me, as if you were giving me a tour. Laura nodded, understanding immediately. We waited until Blake had returned to the executive floor, then timed our exit from the marketing department to intersect, with Amber as she approached her office. Amber, Laura called out. Do you have a moment? I'd like to introduce you to someone. Amber turned, her professional smile freezing slightly as Laura continued. This is Savannah Thompson, Blake's wife. She stopped by today while coordinating some company tax matters. To her credit, Amber recovered quickly, extending her hand. Mrs. Thompson, it's wonderful to finally meet you. Blake speaks about you often. I accepted her handshake, noting the expensive watch on her wrist, the Cartier that had appeared on our credit card statement 3 weeks ago. Please, call me Savannah. I've heard excellent things about your work with the healthcare division. Campaign. Her surprise at my knowledge of her projects was evident. Thank you. It's been an exciting challenge. I imagine so. I maintained eye contact perhaps a moment longer than was comfortable. I've always believed that integrity in marketing is essential, ensuring that what you present to the world aligns with reality. A flash of uncertainty crossed her face. Absolutely. Authenticity is crucial to successful branding. Well, I won't keep you from your work. I'm sure we'll see each other at the company summer party next month. As Laura and I walked away, she whispered, That was masterfully uncomfortable. Sometimes people need a reminder that actions have witnesses, I replied quietly. I left Westlake shortly after, careful to depart before Blake could discover I had been there. On the drive home, I called Catherine to update her on the accelerated timeline. So Blake is planning to file for divorce after securing both the Morton contract and some liquidity from a partial company sale, Catherine summarized, both of which he believes will give him financial independence. Yes. And based on Rachel's information, he may file sooner than we anticipated. Does this change your strategy? I considered the question carefully. No, but it adjusts the timing. We need to be prepared to move immediately after the Morton presentation, but before he can file. Can you have the paperwork ready by next Thursday? Absolutely. I'll prepare everything for immediate filing. But Savannah, once we move, things will escalate quickly. Are you prepared for that? I've been preparing for 6 months, I reminded her. Ever since I found the first evidence of his affair. Not just for the legal battle, Catherine clarified. For the personal fallout. Blake won't just be losing a wife, he'll be losing his company, his identity, his future plans. Men like that can become dangerous when cornered. I understand, I said, thinking of the security measures I had already implemented. Changing the codes on our home system, installing additional cameras, securing my most important documents. I've considered all contingencies. After ending the call, I pulled into our driveway, noting that the gardeners had finished planting the new rose bushes I had ordered, a symbolic gesture that only I understood. These particular roses would bloom long after Blake had left this house. They would be my reminder that while relationships might be temporary, careful planning yielded lasting results. Inside, I moved through our home with new awareness, seeing it through the lens of impending change. The artwork we had collected during our travels, the furniture selected to create the perfect backdrop for entertaining Blake's clients, the photographs chronicling our carefully curated life together. All of it would need to be divided, cataloged, valued. In our home office, I unlocked the filing cabinet that held our household documents. Among them was a leather portfolio containing our insurance policies. I removed the homeowner's policy, turning to the schedules of valuable personal property. Every significant item was listed, photographed, and appraised. The jewelry Blake had given me over the years, artwork, antiques, even his precious watch collection. I noted with satisfaction that everything was properly documented for the division of assets that would come. Blake might believe he was orchestrating our separation on his timeline, but as with everything else in our marriage, the true control lay elsewhere. My phone chimed with a text from Blake. Closing dinner with Stevens tonight. We'll be late. Another lie. According to my sources, the Stevens contract wouldn't be finalized until Friday. Blake was simply creating cover for another evening with Amber. I texted back, "No problem. Elizabeth invited me to the symphony tonight anyway. Enjoy your dinner." Elizabeth was indeed performing with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra tonight, but I had declined her invitation weeks ago. Tonight, I had more important preparations to make. I settled at my desk and opened my laptop, accessing the secure server where I maintained my most confidential files. It was time to finalize my strategy for the coming confrontation, a confrontation Blake didn't yet realize was inevitable. He thought he was planning his escape. In reality, he was walking into a trap of his own making, one constructed from his arrogance, his carelessness, and his fundamental misunderstanding of who had truly built his success. The next morning, I decided it was time to shift from passive monitoring to active investigation. Blake had left early for a breakfast meeting, legitimately this time, with the Stevens Corp executives to finalize details before Friday's contract signing. With the house to myself, I moved to Blake's home office, a space he had claimed as exclusively his own early in our marriage. Business confidentiality, he had explained when setting up the sophisticated biometric lock on the door. Some of my client information is sensitive. I had respected this boundary, or at least he believed I had. In reality, I had ensured access to every part of our shared life, including his supposedly secure spaces. The biometric lock recognized my fingerprint as an authorized user, though Blake had no idea I'd programmed it during the installation 3 years ago while he was on a business trip. The door clicked open. I stepped into the masculine space, designed to project success and authority. Leather furniture, dark wood bookshelves, framed awards, and magazine features about Westlake's rise in the tech consulting world. I moved directly to his desk, an antique partner's desk I'd found at an estate sale in Lake Forest. Unlike Blake's meticulous appearance, his private workspace revealed his true nature. Scattered notes, half-empty coffee cups, charging cables, tangled haphazardly. I didn't bother with the surface items. What I needed would be secured. I turned my attention to the wall safe hidden behind a framed picture of Blake accepting an industry leadership award. The combination, his college graduation year followed by his birthday, was almost insultingly predictable. Inside, I found expected items: his passport, backup credit cards, a modest amount of emergency cash, property deeds for our home and vacation house in Harbor Springs. Beneath these lay what I was looking for: a worn leather portfolio containing documents related to his planned escape. I carefully photographed each page with my phone before returning them precisely as I'd found them. The contents confirmed what Rachel had told me. Blake was preparing for a dramatic life change. Most revealing was a handwritten timeline on Westlake letterhead. April 25, finalize Stevens contract, 3.8. May 2, Morton presentation, 30 Malliter potential. May 10, complete Redwood deal, target, 15 Malliters for 20% stake. June 1st, file papers. June 15th, move to new place. Below this timeline were financial projections showing how Blake planned to leverage these milestones to establish financial independence before leaving our marriage. He had calculated personal earnings from each deal, projected cash positions, and even estimated what he thought would be a fair divorce settlement. His notes showed he expected to keep Westlake entirely, offering me only our primary residence and a cash settlement he considered generous. The arrogance was breathtaking, planning to keep the company that wasn't even his, while calculating a settlement that represented less than 20% of our actual net worth. Most importantly, I found contact information for his recently retained attorney, Richard Hawkins from Keller and Hayes. Hawkins specialized in high net worth divorces and had a reputation for aggressive litigation strategies. The retainer agreement was dated just 3 weeks ago, right after Blake's second meeting with Redwood Partners. I carefully returned the portfolio to its exact position, closed the safe, and restored the room to its original state. As I left, I sent a quick text to Catherine. Richard Hawkins, Keller and Hayes. Recently retained. Timeline accelerating. Her response came immediately. Noted. Hawkins is predictably aggressive but technically sloppy. Will adjust strategy accordingly. Next, I needed to understand the full extent of Blake's relationship with Amber. The affair itself was documented thoroughly by the private investigator, but I needed to determine whether she knew about Westlake's ownership structure. If Blake had shared confidential information with her, it could complicate my strategy. I drove downtown to meet with Rebecca Chen, Westlake's head of human resources. Like Laura, Rebecca had been carefully selected for her role, fiercely competent, professionally discreet, and personally loyal to me rather than Blake. We met at a small bistro several blocks from the office. Amber's personnel file is comprehensive, Rebecca reported after we ordered. Her professional credentials check out. Stanford MBA, excellent performance at her previous firm. Blake pushed hard for her hiring, overriding standard procedures, to fast-track her application. And since joining? Professionally? She's delivered results. Her campaigns have increased client engagement by 32%. The team likes her work, though there's been increasing tension as her special relationship with Blake has become apparent. Special treatment? Rebecca nodded. Access to executive meetings she wouldn't normally attend. Input on strategic decisions. Outside marketing's purview. Most recently, Blake approved a $50,000 marketing discretionary fund that reports directly to her, bypassing normal budget protocols. I processed this information. What about her personal background? Anything noteworthy? Divorced 2 years ago from a hedge fund manager in San Francisco. The settlement was substantial. She's not financially desperate. From what I can gather, her interest in Blake appears genuine. Or her interest in what she believes Blake can provide, I corrected. Has she had access to confidential corporate documents? Board minutes, ownership structure, financing details? Rebecca hesitated. Nothing official through proper channels. However, Blake has had her attend portions of executive committee meetings that would normally be restricted. And 2 weeks ago she was in his office when he was reviewing documentation for the Redwood meetings. This was potentially concerning. If Blake had shared details about his plans for a partial sale of Westlake with Amber, she might have information that could complicate my strategy. I need to know what she knows, I said, making a decision. Can you schedule a marketing review meeting for tomorrow? Something that would require my input as a representative of the Thompson Family Foundation? The foundation was real, another vehicle through which I channeled my family wealth. Blake knew it existed, but paid little attention to its activities. What he didn't realize was that the foundation had been one of Westlake's early clients, providing both revenue and credibility when the company was still establishing itself. Absolutely, Rebecca confirmed. I'll arrange for Amber to present the proposed campaign for the foundation's annual benefit. That would give you legitimate reason to interact directly. Perfect. And Rebecca, thank you. I know this situation puts you in an awkward position. She shook her head firmly. Not at all. My loyalty has always been to the company's true leadership. After leaving Rebecca, I received an unexpected call from Jerome Wilson, the corporate counsel who had structured Westlake's ownership. Savannah, I thought you should know that Blake just requested copies of Westlake's founding documents and all subsequent equity issuances, he reported without preamble. The official reason was preparation for the Redwood Partners discussions. Did you provide them? Only what's appropriate for his level of authority, the basic corporate formation documents and his employment agreement. I explained that the Dow full capitalization table and investment documentation would need formal board approval to release, per the protocols you established. How did he respond? Initial frustration, followed by insistence that as CEO and principal founder, he should have unrestricted access. I held firm on procedure, citing fiduciary duty to all shareholders. This was a significant development. Blake was actively trying to access the very documents that would reveal the truth about Westlake's ownership, documents I had ensured were protected by multiple layers of governance. Has he reached out to any board members directly? I asked. Not yet, but I would expect that to be his next move. Particularly to Douglas Reynolds or Victoria Sanderson, whom he perceives as allies. Douglas and Victoria were independent board members, respected industry veterans who provided governance oversight. What Blake didn't know was that both had long-standing relationships with my family. Douglas had been my father's classmate at Dartmouth, while Victoria had served on multiple boards with my mother. Thank you for the warning, Jerome. If he contacts either of them, they'll redirect him. Appropriately. Of course, and Savannah, be careful. Men like Blake can become unpredictable when they feel cornered. This was the second such warning in 2 days. I was beginning to wonder if my carefully constructed facade was showing cracks, revealing the anger I kept tightly controlled beneath my composed exterior. That evening, I attended the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's performance alone, using the opportunity to think through my next steps. The music, Dvořák's New World Symphony, provided an appropriately dramatic backdrop to my thoughts. During intermission, I stepped onto the terrace and was surprised to encounter James Morton, CEO of Morton Technologies, and the very person Blake would be presenting to next week. Savannah Thompson, he greeted me warmly. A pleasant surprise. Where's Blake this evening? Client dinner? I replied smoothly. The Stevens contract is finalizing this week. Ah, yes. I heard about that win. Impressive work. Morton was in his 60s, with the confident bearing of someone who had built a substantial business through multiple technology transitions. Are you looking forward to our meeting next week? Blake seems quite confident. I maintained a neutral expression. Blake always approaches presentations with confidence. Morton would be a transformative client for Westlake. Yes. Well, relationship alignment is critical in these partnerships. I've always believed the character of leadership reveals itself in personal choices as much as business decisions. Something in his tone caught my attention. A wise perspective, one I share. Morton studied me for a moment. You know, Savannah, I've always respected how you and your family approach business relationships. Your grandfather's reputation for integrity was legendary in Chicago circles. This was unexpected. Most of Blake's business associates knew little about my family background, as I deliberately maintained a low profile. You knew my grandfather? William Calloway was one of my early investors, Morton confirmed. His guidance was invaluable when I was building Morton Technologies. When I heard the Calloway family had connections to Westlake, I'll admit it influenced my interest in potential collaboration. This revelation stunned me. Blake had pursued the Morton contract aggressively for months, never once mentioning any historical connection to my family. Either he was unaware of it, which spoke to his lack of due diligence, or he had deliberately avoided acknowledging it, perhaps fearing it would diminish his perceived role. I wasn't aware you knew about the connection, I said carefully. Morton raised an eyebrow. It's not widely discussed, but in Chicago's business circles, these histories matter. The Calloway investment vehicles are distinctive. Thompson Technology Partners has your family's fingerprints all over its structure. The orchestra bells chimed, signaling the end of intermission. Perhaps we should continue this conversation another time, Morton suggested. Maybe after Blake's presentation next week? I'd value your perspective on how Westlake and Morton might align. I would appreciate that, I replied, mentally adjusting my timeline once again. If Morton already suspected my family's involvement with Westlake, Blake's presentation might face more scrutiny than he anticipated. As I returned to my seat, my phone vibrated with a text from Laura. Urgent development. Blake requested an emergency. Board meeting for Monday to approve the Redwood term sheet. Claims time-sensitive opportunity requires immediate action. This was an aggressive move. Blake was trying to fast-track the Redwood deal before anyone could raise questions about his authority to negotiate it. I texted back, acknowledged. Jerome should invoke the 7-day notice requirement for non-emergency board business. Laura's response came quickly. Already handled. Blake is furious but can't override. Meeting scheduled for next Friday instead. Next Friday, the day after the Morton presentation. Blake's timeline was already beginning to unravel, though he didn't yet realize it. When I arrived home after the concert, the house was dark. According to the security system, Blake hadn't returned. A quick check of his location showed he was at the Four Seasons Hotel downtown. A new pattern in his affair with Amber. They had previously restricted their meetings to her apartment or brief encounters during work hours. A hotel suggested a longer encounter, perhaps overnight. I used this opportunity to access Blake's home computer. His password, Westlake CEO 2023, was as predictable as his safe combination. Inside his email, I found what I was looking for: correspondence, with Richard Hawkins outlining his divorce strategy. As discussed, we'll wait until after the Morton contract is secured and the Redwood investment closes, Blake had written. Both represent significant value increases for Westlake that should be reflected in any settlement discussions. Amber and I plan to relocate to the Gold Coast property once proceedings begin. The Gold Coast property. This was new information. I searched through Blake's recent emails and found communications with a real estate agent about a luxury condo on Lakeshore Drive, a $3.2 million property he had apparently toured twice in the past month. The agent's most recent email confirmed. Purchase agreement being prepared as discussed. Will proceed with an all-cash transaction once funds are available. Blake was planning to buy property with Amber, using proceeds from the Redwood deal. A deal he had no authority to make, for a company he didn't actually own. The audacity was almost admirable. Almost. I continued my search, downloading key documents to a secure external drive. Among Blake's files, I discovered a folder labeled Post-Settlement Strategy, containing detailed plans for Westlake after our divorce. He envisioned expanding the company nationally, opening offices in New York and San Francisco, potentially even pursuing an IPO within 3 years. All built on the foundation of my investment, my connections, my strategic guidance, none of which he acknowledged even in his private planning documents. Most concerning was an email thread with a consultant named Alex Martinez discussing how to reposition key client relationships in anticipation of organizational changes. Blake was already planning how to ensure clients remained loyal to him rather than potentially following me after the divorce, a contingency he clearly considered despite believing I had no official role in the company. Before leaving his office, I carefully restored everything to its original state, ensuring no trace of my investigation remained. As I prepared for bed, I received a final text from Laura. Blake just called an emergency meeting with the executive team for 7:30 tomorrow morning. Topic unspecified. I responded, "Be there, record everything, update me immediately after." Sleep came slowly that night, my mind processing all I had discovered. Blake's plans were more advanced than I had realized, but also more vulnerable. His entire strategy depended on maintaining the fiction that he controlled Westlake, a fiction that was already beginning to crumble as he pushed for transactions. That required deeper scrutiny. Tomorrow would bring my meeting with Amber, potentially revealing how much she knew about Blake's plans and the company's structure. It would also bring whatever emergency Blake felt compelled to address with his executive team. The chess pieces were moving faster now, the game accelerating toward its inevitable conclusion. But while Blake thought he was playing offense, boldly advancing toward his desired future, he failed to recognize he had been in check for months. Soon, it would be a checkmate. Morning arrived with a text from Blake. Early executive meeting. Probably won't see you until dinner. For once, he was telling the truth. I responded with appropriate wifely support. Good luck with whatever's come up. I have foundation meetings most of the day anyway. I dressed with particular care, selecting a St. John knit suit in a deep burgundy that projected both authority and approachability. Today's meeting with Amber required a delicate balance. I needed to extract information without revealing my own knowledge or intentions. At 7:25, Laura called as promised. Blake just dropped a bombshell, she reported, voice hushed. He's announced a potential strategic investment from Redwood Partners, claiming it will accelerate Westlake's growth trajectory and provide resources for national expansion. He presented it as essentially a done deal, pending board formalities. How did the team respond? Mixed. The operations and development leaders seemed cautiously positive. Finance and legal were visibly uncomfortable. They understand this requires approvals Blake doesn't have unilaterally. And the terms he described? 20% equity stake for $15 million, with Blake retaining founder control rights. He specifically emphasized that day-to-day operations wouldn't change, but the capital would enable immediate expansion. I processed this information. Blake was attempting to create momentum and social pressure. If the entire executive team believed the deal was moving forward, it would be harder for the board to reject it without causing organizational disruption. What about Amber? Was she present? Yes, which was unusual for a meeting at this level. Blake introduced it as relevant to marketing because expansion would require brand evolution. But it was transparent favoritism. Did she speak? Briefly. She commented on potential positioning for the next chapter of Westlake's growth story. Seemed like prepared remarks, suggesting Blake had briefed her in advance. This confirmed my suspicion that Amber was more than just a romantic interest. Blake was already positioning her for an expanded role in his post-divorce vision for Westlake. Thank you, Laura. Proceed as normal today. Don't reveal any concerns about Blake's announcement. I'm meeting with Amber at 11 regarding the foundation campaign. Understood. And Savannah, be careful. Blake seemed almost manic this morning. Excessive. Confidence talking about transformational changes coming. Whatever he's planning, he's accelerating. After ending the call, I contacted Catherine to update her on these developments. Her assessment was immediate and direct. He's creating facts on the ground, she concluded, announcing the deal publicly. Before it's approved, making it awkward for anyone to object. It's a common tactic when someone knows they might face resistance. Should we intervene now? I asked, considering whether to abandon my careful timeline. Not yet. Let him continue believing his plan is working. It makes our eventual response more effective when he's fully committed. Catherine paused. But be prepared to move quickly if necessary. I'll have the filing ready by tomorrow just in case. As I drove to Westlake's offices for my meeting with Amber, I reflected on how rapidly events were unfolding. What had begun as a methodical investigation of Blake's betrayal was evolving into a high-stakes corporate chess match, one where Blake believed he held dominant position, unaware that his every move was being anticipated and countered. Today's meeting with Amber would provide crucial information about how much she knew and what role she played in Blake's plans. Was she merely the catalyst for his decision to leave our marriage, or was she an active participant in his corporate maneuvering? Either way, she was about to become an unwitting player in a game where the rules, and the true ownership of the pieces, were very different than she had been led to believe. The Westlake executive floor hummed with activity as I stepped off. The elevator. Employees I passed looked surprised to see me. My visits were rare enough to be noteworthy. I maintained a pleasant, professionally detached demeanor as Rebecca met me at the reception area. Mrs. Thompson, thank you for coming. In today, she said, loud enough for others to hear. The marketing team is excited to present the foundation campaign options. I'm looking forward to it, I replied, following her lead with the public narrative. Rebecca guided me to a mid-sized conference room where Amber was already waiting, surrounded by presentation boards and a laptop connected to the display screen. She stood as we entered, her expression reflecting momentary surprise before settling into professional composure. Mrs. Thompson, what a pleasure to see you again so soon. Her voice was carefully modulated, friendly but respectful. Please, we established yesterday that it's Savannah, I corrected with a warm smile. I apologize for the short notice on this meeting, but the Foundation Board is finalizing budgets next week. Of course. I appreciate your time. Amber gestured to the materials she had prepared. I've developed 3 potential approaches for the annual benefit campaign, each with different messaging strategies. For the next 30 minutes, I observed Amber closely as she delivered a polished presentation. Her marketing concepts were genuinely impressive, sophisticated, strategically sound, aligned with the Foundation's mission. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated her professional talents without reservation. Throughout her presentation, I asked targeted questions designed to reveal how much she knew about Westlake's ownership structure and Blake's plans. The proposal mentions potential synergies between Westlake's healthcare vertical and the Foundation's medical research initiative, I noted. How integrated do you envision this partnership becoming? Amber's response was smooth but revealing. Blake and I have discussed positioning Westlake for expanded healthcare sector penetration. The foundation connection creates natural opportunities, especially with the planned organizational evolution over the next quarter. Blake and I have discussed. The casual reference to strategic planning conversations confirmed what I suspected. Blake was already treating Amber as more than just the marketing director. He was including her in discussions about Westlake's future direction. Organizational evolution? I prompted, maintaining an expression of mild interest. Just the standard growth trajectories, she replied, backpedaling slightly. Blake mentioned the foundation might play a role in upcoming strategic partnerships. I nodded thoughtfully. The foundation has always valued its relationship with Westlake. It was one of our earliest partnerships before Blake had established much of a client base. A flicker of confusion crossed Amber's face. This clearly contradicted whatever narrative Blake had shared with her about Westlake's founding and early growth. I didn't realize the foundation was involved so early, she said carefully. Oh yes, my family has always believed in supporting promising ventures, especially when led by people with potential. I maintained direct eye contact. The right guidance and resources at the beginning stages can be transformative. Amber shifted uncomfortably, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. That's very forward-thinking. I redirected the conversation back to the campaign proposals, approving her second concept with minor modifications. As the meeting concluded, I made one final probe. I understand there's excitement about potential new investors. Will that affect the marketing strategy for existing partnerships like the foundation? Her surprise was evident. Blake had apparently not expected news of the Redwood discussions to reach me so quickly. Blake mentioned something about growth capital, she acknowledged cautiously. But I don't have details on how it might impact existing relationships. Change can create wonderful opportunities, I observed, gathering my notes. Though in my experience, understanding the true power structures is essential when navigating transitions. I left her considering this ambiguous statement, having confirmed what I needed to know. Amber was aware of Blake's business maneuvers, but not fully informed about the company's ownership structure. She was operating on whatever selective information Blake had chosen to share, information that omitted the fundamental truth about who actually owned Westlake. After leaving Westlake, I drove not home but to an unassuming office building in Evanston. The modest exterior belied the expertise housed within. This was the headquarters of Hamilton Strategic Advisors, a boutique consulting firm specializing in complex corporate governance matters and succession planning for privately held companies. Dr. Thomas Hamilton, the firm's founder and principal consultant, had been my father's trusted advisor for decades. At 72, his white hair and grandfatherly appearance concealed one of the sharpest strategic minds in Chicago business. More importantly, he had no connection to Blake or Westlake. His involvement would remain completely below the radar. Savannah, right on time, Thomas greeted me, rising from behind his desk. The office was a reflection of the man, unpretentious but meticulous, with carefully organized bookshelves and framed academic credentials from Harvard Business School. Thank you for making time on such short notice, I replied, accepting his handshake for William Calloway's granddaughter? Always. He gestured to the sitting area where a tea service had been arranged. Besides, your message suggested urgency. For the next hour, I laid out the complete situation. Blake's affair, his plans to divorce me after securing the Morton contract and Redwood investment, and his fundamental misconception about who actually owned Westlake. Thomas listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal. When I finished, he sat back, fingers steepled thoughtfully. You've created quite an elegant structure, he observed. Thompson Technology Partners own controlling interest in Westlake, with your full ownership of TTP through Callaway Holdings. Blake's name on the operational documents, but not the actual ownership chain. My grandfather taught me to separate control from ownership, I explained. He believed true power lies in structures, Not titles. Thomas nodded approvingly. William was always 3 moves ahead of everyone else. You've clearly inherited that trait. He tapped his pen against his notes. The immediate question is timing. When do you intend to reveal the actual ownership structure to Blake? That's part of why I'm here. The situation is accelerating faster than I anticipated. Blake has announced the Redwood investment to his executive team before securing board approval. He's trying to create momentum that will be difficult to stop. A common tactic when someone lacks actual authority creates the appearance of inevitability. Thomas considered for a moment. What's your primary objective here, Savannah? Financial protection? Professional vindication? Personal justice? The question made me pause. I had been so focused on methodical response that I hadn't fully articulated my ultimate goal, even to myself. All of those, I acknowledged. But primarily, I want Blake to understand the true nature of what he's built, or rather, what he believes he's built. His entire identity is wrapped up in being the successful founder and CEO of Westlake. I want him to confront the reality that his success has always been built on my foundation. Thomas nodded slowly. So, this isn't just about preventing him from taking what isn't his. It's about forcing him to recognize what was never his to begin with. Exactly. In that case, Thomas said, opening a drawer to retrieve a legal pad, we need to orchestrate not just the revelation but its psychological impact. Timing and context become crucial. He began sketching a timeline. When is the Morton presentation? Next Thursday. And the board meeting to consider the Redwood investment? Friday, the day after. Thomas tapped his pen thoughtfully. The sequence matters here. If you reveal the ownership structure before the Morton presentation, you risk disrupting a potentially valuable contract for Westlake, which, as the actual owner, isn't in your interest. I've considered that, I agreed. The Morton contract is significant regardless of Blake's personal plans. However, Thomas continued, if you wait until after the board meeting, Blake might have created enough momentum with Redwood that unwinding those expectations becomes messier than necessary. So the optimal window is after the Morton presentation, but before the board approves the Redwood investment, I concluded. Precisely. Thursday evening to Friday morning. Thomas began writing more detailed notes. But the revelation can't come directly from you that undermines the psychological impact. It needs to come through official channels, forcing Blake to confront the corporate reality rather than just a personal disclosure. This aligned with my instincts, but hearing it from Thomas provided valuable confirmation. For the next hour, we constructed a detailed sequence of events, legal notifications, board communications, and corporate governance procedures that would systematically dismantle Blake's illusions while protecting Westlake's operational integrity. There's one more consideration, Thomas said as we finalized the plan. The other executives at Westlake. How do you want to handle the organizational fallout? This was something I had contemplated extensively. Most of the leadership team was selected by me, though Blake believes they're his hires. Laura and Rebecca already know the truth. For others, I need a clear demonstration that this transition won't threaten their positions, only Blake's. A statement of continuity, Thomas suggested, distributed immediately after the revelation to Blake, but before wider knowledge spreads, emphasizing stability while clarifying actual authority. I nodded. I'll work with Catherine to draft appropriate messaging. As our meeting concluded, Thomas offered one final piece of advice. Savannah, I've seen many corporate battles over the decades. The most unpredictable element is always human emotion. Blake has built his identity on a fundamental misunderstanding. When that's shattered, his reaction won't be rational. I'm prepared for that, I assured him. Are you? Thomas asked gently. This isn't just about legal preparations or corporate strategy. This is a man you've been married to for 12 years, whose entire sense of self is about to implode. The Psychological violence of this revelation shouldn't be underestimated. His words gave me pause. I had focused so intently on the methodical execution of my response that I hadn't fully considered the emotional explosion that would inevitably follow. What do you suggest? Personal security measures, for one. Thomas replied instantly. Not just document security or financial protections. Physical security for yourself. Men in Blake's position sometimes react with disproportionate anger when their self-image is threatened. This echoed Catherine's earlier warning, making it impossible to dismiss. I'll arrange it, I promised. And consider having a neutral third party present for the actual moment of revelation, someone with authority that Blake respects, but who has no direct connection to either of you. It provides a restraining influence during the most volatile moment. I considered this recommendation. I may have someone in mind. After leaving Thomas's office, I drove to my next appointment, a meeting with Henry Collins, former FBI agent turned private security consultant. Catherine had recommended him as discreet, thorough, and experienced with high-net-worth security situations. Collins operated from a converted industrial space in the West Loop, far from the gleaming downtown towers where most professionals conducted business. The space was purposefully nondescript from the outside, but the interior revealed sophisticated security systems and a meticulously organized operation. Ms. Calloway, Collins greeted me, using my family name rather than Thompson. Catherine had obviously briefed him thoroughly. Your situation presents several unique security considerations. I'm primarily concerned about the immediate aftermath of revelation, I explained as he led me to a conference room. My husband will be experiencing something significant, adjustment to his understanding of reality. Collins nodded, his expression neutral. In my experience, when individuals face sudden status and identity threats, particularly males with high social position, their reactions follow predictable patterns. First denial, then anger, often followed by attempts to reassert control through whatever means they perceive available. That's my concern, I confirmed. Blake's entire identity is built around being the successful founder and CEO of Westlake. When he learns that the foundation is illusory, his reaction won't be rational. You've maintained normal marital relations despite your knowledge of his infidelity? Collins asked, switching to security assessment mode. Yes. He believes I'm unaware of both the affair and his divorce plans. Good. The element of surprise works in our favor for security planning. Collins opened a laptop, pulling up floor plans of what I recognized as our home. Catherine provided these with your permission. I'll need to verify a few details about your routine and Blake's usual patterns. For the next hour, Collins conducted a thorough assessment of potential security vulnerabilities, physical access points at our home, Blake's likely emotional triggers, mutual acquaintances who might inadvertently provide him access after the revelation. His methodical approach was reassuring, transforming nebulous concerns into concrete problems with specific solutions. I recommend immediate installation of enhanced security systems at your primary residence, Collins concluded. Upgraded access controls, motion detection, and remote monitoring, all implemented discreetly as general security upgrades to avoid raising suspicion. That can be arranged today? My team can complete installation by this evening, presented as a scheduled security maintenance if Blake inquires. And personal security? Based on your timeline, I suggest protective detail beginning Thursday morning, before the Morton presentation. Plain clothes, unobtrusive, but continuously present through the initial aftermath period. Collins showed me profiles of 2 security professionals on his tablet, Terry Matthews and Angela Diaz, both former law enforcement with extensive experience in executive protection. They'll coordinate continuous coverage without drawing attention. I reviewed the information, noting their impressive credentials. Blake has no history of physical violence, I felt compelled to clarify. These measures may seem excessive. With respect, Ms. Calloway, you're describing a situation where a man's entire identity and perceived achievements are about to be revealed as fundamentally misunderstood. Even individuals without violent histories can react unpredictably to such profound psychological trauma. Collins's expression remained professional but emphatic. In security planning, we prepare for behavioral departures from established patterns, not their continuation. His perspective was sobering but valid. I approved the security arrangements, providing necessary access information for the home system upgrades and agreeing to Collins's recommended protocols for the coming days. As I left Collins's office, my phone rang with a call from Jerome Wilson. "Savannah, we have a situation," he began without preamble. "Blake just called an emergency meeting of Westlake's legal team. He's demanding preparation of definitive documents for the Redwood transaction by Thursday morning before the board meeting on Friday." This represented a significant escalation. Blake was trying to create a legally binding framework that would be difficult to unwind, even without proper authorization. "On what authority is he making this request?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He's claiming executive authority under his employment agreement. When counsel noted that equity transactions require board approval, he insisted this was merely preparation of documents for board consideration, rather than execution. A distinction without difference if the documents are presented to Redwood as imminent, I observed. How did the legal team respond? Professional resistance. They've agreed to prepare preliminary materials, but emphasized repeatedly that execution requires proper governance procedures. Jerome paused. "Savannah, he's growing increasingly aggressive. This morning's interaction showed a different Blake than I've dealt with previously, demanding, dismissive of corporate formalities, acting as if objections to his authority were personal affronts." "Is he currently at Westlake?" "No." After the legal team meeting, he left for what his calendar shows as client meetings downtown. His assistant mentioned he's not expected back today. I checked the tracking app on my phone. Blake was at Amber's apartment again, his third visit this week during business hours. "Thank you for the update, Jerome. Please continue monitoring the situation with the legal team. If Blake pushes further, have them escalate any concerns to you directly, rather than challenging him openly." After ending the call, I drove to my final appointment of the day. Dinner with Judge Eleanor Montgomery, my mother's closest friend and a recently retired federal judge. Eleanor had been a mentor throughout my life, offering wisdom drawn from her decades on the bench. More importantly, she represented exactly what Thomas Hamilton had suggested, a respected authority figure with no direct connection to Westlake who could serve as a neutral presence during the coming confrontation. We met at Harrington's, an old-school Chicago institution known for privacy and discretion. Eleanor was already seated in a secluded corner booth when I arrived. At 70, she remained impressive. Silver hair cut in a precise bob, posture straight from decades of commanding courtrooms. "Savannah," she greeted me with a warm embrace. "You're looking well, considering the circumstances." I had briefed Eleanor on the situation the previous week, seeking her perspective on both legal and personal aspects of my approach. "It's been an illuminating few days," I replied, settling across from her. "Blake's actions are accelerating faster than I anticipated." Over appetizers, I updated her on recent developments: Blake's premature announcement of the Redwood investment, his pressure on Westlake's legal team, and the security measures I had arranged based on multiple warnings about his potential reaction. Eleanor listened intently, her judicial experience evident in her focused attention and occasional clarifying questions. When I finished, she took a thoughtful sip of her wine before responding. "You've been methodical in your approach, which I commend. Too often, betrayal prompts impulsive reactions that undermine long-term interests." She set down her glass precisely. "However, I'm concerned about the emotional toll this is taking. You present as composed, but I've known you since childhood, Savannah. This calculated response requires suppressing significant pain. I'm managing, I assured her. I don't doubt that. But containment isn't the same as processing. Eleanor's gaze was penetrating. What happens after the revelation? After Blake understands the truth and faces consequences? Have you considered your path forward? The question caught me by surprise. I had been so focused on executing my response to Blake's betrayal that I hadn't given much thought to what came after. I assume I'll continue leading Westlake, though perhaps more directly than through the current structure, I replied. The company has significant potential, regardless of Blake's personal failings. And personally, your life has been entangled with Blake's for 15 years, between business school and marriage. When that relationship ends, what fills that? Space? I had no immediate answer. Eleanor didn't press, instead shifting to more tactical matters. You mentioned needing a neutral third party present for the moment of revelation. I assume that's why you've invited me to dinner. Yes, I acknowledged. Thomas Hamilton suggested having someone with authority that Blake respects, but no direct stake in the outcome. Your judicial background makes you ideal. Blake has always been somewhat intimidated by you. Eleanor smiled slightly. The effect of the robe lingers even in retirement. I'd be willing to serve in this capacity, though I want to be clear about my role. I'm not there to mediate or negotiate, merely to provide a stabilizing presence during a volatile moment. That's exactly what I need, I confirmed. The revelation will happen at Westlake after the Morton presentation on Thursday. Blake will be either celebrating his perceived triumph or processing disappointment. Either way, emotionally vulnerable to the truth. And the actual disclosure? How will that occur? Jerome will deliver formal notification of the board's rejection of the Redwood proposal, citing lack of authorization from the majority shareholder, me, through Thompson Technology Partners. Simultaneously, Catherine will serve Blake with divorce papers that reference the corporate ownership structure. Eleanor nodded slowly. A two-pronged revelation, professional and personal simultaneously. Effective, if somewhat brutal in its comprehensiveness. He left me little choice, I noted. His own timeline forced this approach. If he hadn't accelerated his plans with Redwood while pursuing the affair with Amber, I might have chosen a more gradual disclosure. I understand the necessity, Eleanor assured me. I'll be there Thursday. What time? 4 o'clock. The Morton presentation ends at 3. As we finished dinner, Eleanor offered one final observation. Savannah, I've presided over hundreds of cases involving betrayal in various forms. The most difficult recoveries weren't from the betrayal itself, but from the self-recrimination that followed. The questioning of one's own judgment, the wondering how one missed crucial signs. I've already begun that process, I admitted. 15 years with someone who fundamentally misunderstood, or chose to ignore, the true foundation of his success. It reflects poorly on my judgment. Or perhaps, Eleanor suggested gently, it reflects a generous spirit that wanted to give someone else the space to believe in their own capabilities, even if that belief required some useful fictions. Not all illusions are malicious, Savannah. Sometimes they're gifts we offer to those we love. Her perspective gave me pause. Had I enabled Blake's misconceptions out of generosity rather than manipulation? Had my original intentions been more benevolent than I now allowed myself to remember? These questions lingered as I drove home, the city lights blurring slightly as I considered what the coming days would bring. Blake's carefully constructed reality was about to shatter. My meticulously planned response was in motion. The only remaining question was whether either of us would recognize ourselves in the aftermath. The following morning brought a shift in Blake's behavior, subtle but noticeable. He appeared at breakfast earlier than usual, dressed impeccably in his favorite Tom Ford suit, reserved for major client presentations. "You're looking sharp today," I observed, pouring coffee. "Special occasion?" "The Stevens closing," he replied, accepting the cup with a smile that seemed almost genuine. Then, preliminary meetings with the Morton team. They wanted to discuss technical requirements before next week's formal presentation. This was new information. According to Laura, the pre-presentation technical review had been scheduled for tomorrow, not today. That's earlier than expected, I noted casually. You mentioned it was happening Friday. Blake barely hesitated. They moved it up. Their CTO is heading to Singapore this weekend and wanted to be involved in the technical assessment. Another lie, smoothly delivered. I checked my phone discreetly. According to the calendar I shared with Laura, Morton's CTO had no international travel scheduled. Well, good luck, I offered. The Stevens closing should be straightforward after all your preparation. Blake nodded, his attention already elsewhere. I'll be home late. Celebration dinner with the Stevens team after the signing. Of course. The hospital auxiliary committee has an event tonight anyway. I might stay downtown afterward for drinks with Elizabeth. His relief at my independent plans was barely concealed. Perfect timing, then. As Blake gathered his things to leave, he paused unexpectedly, studying me with an intensity that momentarily made me wonder if he suspected my awareness. You know, Savannah, he said, his tone unusually reflective, I've been thinking about how much we've built together. Sometimes I don't properly acknowledge your role in my success. The statement was so out of character that I momentarily lost my carefully maintained composure. That's thoughtful of you to say. I mean it, he continued, maintaining eye contact, longer than usual. The support you've provided has been invaluable. I wouldn't be where I am without you. With that cryptic acknowledgement, the closest Blake had ever come to recognizing my true contribution, he kissed my cheek and departed, leaving me to wonder about this sudden display of appreciation. Was it genuine recognition, or merely guilt, manifesting as he prepared to discard our marriage? Either way, the timing was suspicious. I immediately texted Laura. Blake mentioned technical review with Morton today instead of tomorrow. Verify actual schedule? Her response came quickly. No change in Morton's schedule. Technical review is still Friday. Blake's calendar shows client lunch at Gibson's today, not Morton. Gibson's was an upscale steakhouse where Blake often entertained clients, a legitimate business venue that wouldn't raise suspicions. I checked the tracking app on my phone and confirmed Blake was indeed heading downtown, but not directly to Westlake's offices or to the Stevens Corporation for the supposed contract signing. Instead, he was traveling to an address in River North that I didn't immediately recognize. I entered it into a search engine and discovered it was the location of Bennington, Frost & Associates, one of Chicago's premier corporate law firms specializing in mergers and acquisitions. This was concerning. Bennington Frost wasn't Westlake's. Corporate counsel, that role belonged to Jerome Wilson's firm. Why would Blake be meeting with different attorneys on the morning of an important contract closing? I forwarded the address to Catherine with a question mark. Her response was immediate. Alexander Frost is Richard Hawkins' law partner. Divorce and corporate strategizing likely happening in tandem. This made sense. Blake was coordinating his divorce strategy with his corporate maneuvers, likely seeking ways to protect what he believed was his company from our marital dissolution. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so high. I had planned to use today for final preparations before tomorrow's security implementation, but Blake's unexpected moves suggested I needed to accelerate my information gathering. After ensuring Blake was settled at his meeting, I drove to our home and headed directly to his office. The biometric lock opened smoothly to my touch. Inside, I went straight to his laptop, which he had uncharacteristically left at home. Blake typically took his computer everywhere, especially on days with important client meetings. Leaving it behind suggested either uncharacteristic carelessness or a deliberate choice to use different devices for whatever he was planning today. The laptop was password protected, but I had long ago ensured I could access his devices if necessary. His password manager conveniently stored all his credentials, including those for his Westlake email and cloud storage accounts. Within minutes, I discovered what Blake had been working on that morning, a presentation document titled Westlake, Strategic Restructuring. The file detailed plans for significant organizational changes following the Redwood investment, including a new corporate structure with Blake as CEO and chairman, creation of a strategic innovation group, led by Amber, Russell relocation of headquarters to a prestigious Michigan, Avenue address termination of several executives who Blake deemed legacy personnel. Most concerning, a section titled Ownership Protection Strategies that outlined methods to insulate founder equity from personal claims. This last section made Blake's intentions crystal clear. He was actively seeking ways to shield Westlake from what he anticipated would be my divorce claims. The document included consultation points for his meeting at Bennington Frost, specifically asking about equity trusts, offshore holding structures, and pre-transaction protective measures. I photographed each page with my phone, ensuring I captured the document in its entirety. Then I searched for other recent files, discovering a folder labeled Personal Transition that contained detailed financial projections showing anticipated proceeds from the Redwood transaction, a purchase agreement for the Gold Coast Condominium Communications, with a relocation service about moving selected personal items, a draft letter formally ending his Westlake employment agreement to be replaced, with a new executive contract with enhanced protections. The level of detail was striking. Blake had methodically planned every aspect of his transition to a new life with Amber, untethered from our marriage, and with financial independence secured through the Redwood deal. The timeline showed everything orchestrated to unfold within a 6-week window, culminating in what he labeled complete separation, both personal and professional, by early July. Most revealing was an email draft addressed to Westlake's board members, announcing both the Redwood investment and his personal changes, framed as entering a new chapter of life and leadership. The carefully crafted message presented the divorce and corporate restructuring as positive evolutions, beneficial for all parties involved. After documenting everything, I restored the laptop exactly as I'd found it and turned my attention to Blake's physical files. The safe contained updated versions of documents I'd seen previously, along with new items, a preliminary term sheet from Redwood Partners, a confidential performance assessment of Westlake's executive team, with recommendations for retention or replacement of personal inventory, categorizing our shared possessions as essential or dispensable. I photographed each document before returning it precisely to its original location. As I prepared to leave Blake's office, a notification appeared on his laptop. An incoming email from Richard Hawkins with the subject, Preemptive Filing Strategy. The message preview visible on the screen contained a single line. Recommend. Proceeding with Thursday filing as discussed. Timing advantages are significant. Thursday, the day of the Morton presentation. Blake was planning to file for divorce immediately after securing the contract, rather than waiting for the Redwood deal to close. This represented a significant acceleration of his timeline, potentially disrupting my carefully orchestrated response. I needed to understand why. After ensuring everything in Blake's office was exactly as I'd found it, I left our home and drove directly to Catherine's office for an emergency consultation. This changes our approach, Catherine confirmed, after reviewing the evidence I'd gathered. Blake appears to be positioning for a preemptive strike, filing immediately after the Morton success to establish a narrative of peak corporate value before any divorce proceedings begin. But the Redwood deal wouldn't be finalized by then, I pointed out. His strategy assumed liquidity from that transaction. Not necessarily, Catherine corrected, studying Blake's financial projections. These calculations show he's secured a personal loan against his anticipated proceeds from Redwood, essentially a bridge financing arrangement that provides immediate funds before the actual transaction closes. This explained Blake's accelerated timeline. He had found a way to access capital immediately, rather than waiting for the Redwood deal to complete. Who would provide such financing? I asked. It's extremely risky without the deal being finalized. Catherine scrolled through the documents. Appears to be through Platinum Capital Partners. They specialize in executive liquidity solutions, high-interest loans for executives awaiting transaction proceeds. I knew Platinum Capital by reputation. They catered to impatient executives willing to sacrifice significant value for immediate access to funds. Their involvement suggested Blake was growing increasingly desperate to expedite his plans. This loan would be invalidated once the Redwood deal collapses, I noted. Yes, but Blake would already have deployed the funds by then, purchasing the condominium, establishing separate accounts, creating facts on the ground that would complicate unwinding, Catherine explained. It's actually quite clever from a tactical perspective, if morally bankrupt. We spent the next hour revising our strategy in light of this new information. If Blake intended to file on Thursday immediately following the Morton presentation, I needed to be positioned to respond instantly, rather than waiting until Friday morning as originally planned. We can have the counterfilings prepared for immediate submission, Catherine assured me. The moment Blake's attorney files, we'll respond with our comprehensive package, divorce response, corporate ownership documentation, and injunctions against any asset transfers. And if he attempts to file before Thursday? We've established monitoring of the court docket, Catherine explained. Any filing under either of your names triggers an immediate alert. We can respond within hours regardless of when he makes his move. After finalizing these contingencies with Catherine, I contacted Thomas Hamilton to update him on the accelerated timeline. Not surprising, Thomas observed after hearing the developments. Blake senses his window of opportunity narrowing. The Redwood discussions likely raised questions he struggled to answer, making him aware that deeper due diligence might uncover the actual ownership structure. So he's rushing to establish his position before that happens, I concluded. Precisely. In my experience, when someone accelerates a complex plan, they inevitably create vulnerabilities. Blake is now making decisions based on urgency rather than optimal strategy. Thomas paused thoughtfully. This actually strengthens your position if you remain disciplined in your approach. Next, I updated Henry Collins about the compressed timeline, ensuring the security implementation would be completed today rather than tomorrow. We'll expedite everything, Collins confirmed. Security team will be operational by this evening rather than tomorrow morning. I recommend you maintain normal patterns until then to avoid triggering Blake's suspicions. He's already behaving differently, I noted. This morning, he expressed unusual appreciation for my support throughout our marriage, almost as if he was acknowledging my contribution while preparing to undermine it. Classic psychological preparation, Collins observed. Creating an emotional record he can later reference to justify his actions. I acknowledged her support because I was fair in recognizing her contribution when he needs to rationalize what follows. The insight was disturbing, but rang true. Blake was creating a narrative that cast him as reasonable and appreciative, even while actively planning to discard both our marriage and my role in building Westlake. By mid-afternoon, I had updated all key members of my response team about the BAOI accelerated timeline. Laura confirmed that Blake had returned to Westlake after his meeting at Bennington, Frost, and was now focused on the Stevens contract closing. According to her observations, he appeared energized and confident, the behavior of someone who believed all pieces of his plan were falling perfectly into place. I used this opportunity to visit First Chicago Private Bank to retrieve and review the original Westlake founding documents. The bank manager led me to the private viewing room where I carefully examined each critical document that established my ownership. The original formation of Thompson Technology Partners, showing my 100% ownership through Callaway Holdings, the investment agreement providing initial capitalization for Westlake Blake's employment agreement, detailing his equity grant of 49% of Westlake Shares Board, resolutions confirming the ownership structure, all subsequent financing rounds, documenting capital contributions from Thompson Technology Partners. Everything was in perfect order, creating an ironclad record of actual ownership that would shatter Blake's misconceptions. I made additional copies of key documents for Catherine, ensuring we had redundant records available for immediate deployment when needed. While at the bank, I also took the precaution of transferring additional funds to accounts Blake couldn't access. Although our prenuptial agreement provided significant protection, I had learned from Catherine that practical access to liquidity often proved decisive in the early stages of high-conflict divorces. My next stop was a discreet meeting with Douglas Reynolds, the Westlake board member Blake believed was his ally. We met at the University Club, a venue where Chicago's business elite could converse without attracting attention. Blake called me yesterday, Douglas confirmed after we exchanged. Greetings. He was seeking my preliminary approval for the Redwood transaction before the formal board meeting. When I asked about shareholder approvals, he became notably defensive. What exactly did he say? I asked. That as founder and CEO, he had full authority to negotiate strategic investments. When I pressed specifically about Thompson Technology Partners' approval as majority shareholder, he became evasive, claiming those were administrative details that would be handled through proper channels after board approval. Did you challenge that characterization? Douglas smiled slightly. I simply noted that in my experience, majority shareholders generally expect consultation before, not after, significant equity transactions. He changed the subject rather abruptly. This conversation confirmed what I had suspected. Blake was attempting to circumvent normal corporate governance by creating momentum with individual board members, hoping to present Thompson Technology Partners with a fait accompli. The strategy might have worked if TTP were truly an independent investment entity rather than my personal holding company. Has he approached Victoria as well? I asked, referring to the other independent board member. Yesterday afternoon, according to Victoria. She reported a similar conversation, heavy on vision and opportunity, light on governance and process. Douglas studied me thoughtfully. You've been extraordinarily patient, Savannah. Most owners would have intervened much earlier. There were personal considerations that complicated the timing, I acknowledged. Douglas nodded understanding, without pressing for details. Well, both Victoria and I are prepared for Friday's board meeting. We'll follow your lead on how to proceed. After leaving Douglas, I received an unexpected call from James Morton himself. Mrs. Thompson, he began formally. I hope I'm not interrupting your day. Not at all, Mr. Morton. This is a pleasant surprise. I wanted to follow up on our conversation at the Symphony, he continued, particularly in light of our technical review with Westlake scheduled for tomorrow. Is there anything I should be aware of regarding the company's situation? His careful phrasing suggested he sensed underlying tensions, but was too professional to ask directly about potential problems. The technical review should proceed as planned, I assured him. Westlake's capabilities and expertise are genuine, regardless of any organizational adjustments that might occur in the coming days. I see, Morton replied thoughtfully. And next week's formal presentation? Should we anticipate any changes to that schedule? The presentation will proceed as planned, I confirmed, though the presenter might have a different perspective by then on certain aspects of Westlake's leadership structure. Morton's chuckle suggested he understood the subtext. Clarity about actual authority is always valuable in business relationships. I look forward to next week's revelations, whatever form they may take. As evening approached, I returned home to find Blake had not yet arrived. According to the tracking app, he was still at Westlake's offices, legitimately working late for perhaps the first time in months. The Stevens contract closing had apparently proceeded as scheduled, followed by executive meetings that extended into early evening. This gave me the opportunity to meet briefly with Collins's security team as they completed the enhanced system installation. Terry Matthews and Angela Diaz, my assigned protection specialists, conducted a thorough walkthrough of the property, identifying optimal positioning and potential vulnerability points. We'll maintain a discreet presence beginning tomorrow morning, Matthews explained. Ms. Diaz will accompany you to any external meetings while I monitor your residence. We'll adjust coverage based on Mr. Thompson's movements. Our objective is preventive deterrence, Diaz added. Most situations de-escalate. Naturally, when individuals realize security professionals are present, we don't anticipate actual intervention being necessary. I appreciated their professional approach, focused on prevention rather than confrontation, maintaining the dignity of all parties involved while ensuring my safety during a volatile transition. By the time Blake finally arrived home shortly after 9, the security upgrades were complete and the team had departed. He appeared genuinely exhausted but satisfied, the expression of someone who believed their carefully laid plans were progressing perfectly. Stephen's contract closed successfully, he announced, loosening his tie. Full implementation schedule, no last-minute changes. 36-month commitment with guaranteed minimums exceeding projections. Congratulations, I replied with appropriate enthusiasm. That's significant validation of your approach. Blake poured himself a scotch, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. The technical review with the Morton team is tomorrow at 10. Not the formal presentation yet, but crucial groundwork. Their security requirements are extensive, much more than typical clients. I'm sure the team is prepared, I offered. You've always emphasized security protocols in Westlake's solutions. Yes. Blake seemed momentarily distracted. Savannah, would you have dinner with me tomorrow night? Just the two of us. There's something important I want to discuss. The invitation startled me. According to his documented timeline, tomorrow he would be finalizing preparations for Thursday's Morton presentation and coordinating with Richard Hawkins about the divorce filing. A private dinner didn't fit those plans. Of course, I agreed, monitoring his expression carefully. Anything special you want to discuss? Blake hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. Just the future, priorities, things we haven't really talked about lately. Was Blake preparing to reveal his divorce plans personally, rather than through legal channels? If so, it represented a significant deviation from the strategy documented in his files. Or perhaps he sensed something amiss and was testing my reaction. The one. Sounds important, I replied neutrally. Should I make a reservation somewhere? I'll handle it, he said quickly. Gibson's private room at 7. I've already arranged it. The specificity suggested this wasn't a spontaneous suggestion, but something he had planned in advance. Another piece in his increasingly complex strategy that I couldn't yet fully decode. I look forward to it, I said with a smile that revealed nothing of my suspicions. Later that night, as Blake slept beside me, I lay awake considering the implications of his dinner invitation. Was it a genuine attempt at honest conversation before initiating divorce proceedings? A strategic move to gauge my awareness of his plans? Or something else entirely that I hadn't anticipated? Whatever his intentions, the invitation had inadvertently given me valuable information. Blake would be occupied at a specific location tomorrow evening, providing an opportunity to implement final preparations without risk of interruption. I texted Catherine with this update. Blake requested a private dinner tomorrow night at Gibson's. Claims important discussion planned. Adjust timeline accordingly? Her response came despite the late hour, possible divorce discussion preempting legal filing. Maintain the appearance of normalcy but be prepared for emotional manipulation. We'll have a team on standby. As I finally drifted toward sleep, I contemplated the strange choreography of our situation. Husband and wife sharing a bed while separately plotting dramatic revelations, each believing they controlled the narrative. That would unfold in the coming days. By this time tomorrow night, Blake would likely have revealed his divorce intentions, believing he was delivering a shocking announcement that would destabilize my world. He couldn't possibly imagine that his revelation would be merely a footnote in the much larger disclosure awaiting him on Thursday, the day he would learn who actually owned the company he believed was his to control, leverage, and potentially sell. The irony would be almost poetic if it weren't so profoundly sad. 6 months had passed since the day that had come to be known within Westlake as simply the revelation. The Chicago winter had arrived early, blanketing the city in snow that transformed the urban landscape into something almost serene. From my office on the 42nd floor, Blake's former corner suite, I could see the entire downtown skyline glittering in the December twilight. The transition had been neither easy nor quiet, but it had been complete. As Catherine had predicted, Blake's reaction to discovering the truth about Westlake's ownership had progressed through predictable stages: shock, denial, rage, desperate negotiation, and finally, a bitter acceptance that left him fundamentally changed. I still remembered the precise moment when understanding had dawned in his eyes. We had been in the Westlake boardroom immediately following his triumphant Morton presentation. The contract, worth $32 million, slightly exceeding projections, had been signed less than an hour earlier. Blake had been exultant, believing this. Achievement cemented his professional legacy and secured his personal freedom. Judge Eleanor Montgomery had been present, as planned, seated quietly at the far end of the conference table as Jerome Wilson delivered the news that the board was rejecting Blake's proposed Redwood investment. When Blake demanded an explanation, Jerome had calmly placed the complete ownership documentation on the table. The majority shareholder does not approve the transaction, Jerome had stated simply. Thompson Technology Partners hasn't even reviewed the full proposal, Blake had argued, his confidence still intact. I've discussed preliminary terms with their representative. They understand the strategic value. Yes, they do, I confirmed, speaking for the first time. Thompson Technology Partners understands the proposal perfectly and declines to proceed. Blake had stared at me, confusion evident. You're not involved in that decision. TTP works through their designated. I am their designated representative. I had interrupted gently. Thompson Technology Partners is my holding company, Blake. It always has been. The silence that followed had been absolute. I watched realization slowly transform his expression from confusion to disbelief. That's not possible, he had whispered. I founded Westlake. I built it from nothing. You built it from $2.4 million in seed funding, I had corrected. My seed funding, channeled through TTP. You've been CEO of my company for 12 years, building it with my capital, my connections, and often my strategies. Catherine had chosen that moment to enter, serving Blake with divorce papers that explicitly referenced the corporate ownership structure and invalidated his claims to Westlake's assets. The dual revelations, professional and personal, had left him momentarily speechless. When Blake had finally found his voice, it emerged as cold fury. This is some kind of elaborate fraud. You're manipulating documents, creating retroactive claims. I'll fight this. I'll burn everything down before I let you steal my company. Judge Montgomery had intervened then, her judicial authority providing crucial stabilization. Mr. Thompson, I've reviewed the documentation extensively. The ownership structure is legitimate, established at formation, and maintained consistently throughout Westlake's existence. The signatures on all founding documents are authenticated, including yours. Fighting these facts would not serve your interests. The security team had proven necessary after all. Blake's composure had shattered completely when Amber arrived. At his urgent summons, only to learn that the company she believed she would help lead with him was never his to control. His verbal assault had turned physical, not toward me, but toward the boardroom wall, his fist connecting with the plaster in a moment of uncontrolled rage that had left both damage and blood. Terry Matthews had appeared instantly, his presence alone sufficient to restore order. Judge Montgomery had suggested a recess, allowing Blake time to consult privately with Richard Hawkins, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as he reviewed the documentation Catherine had provided. Now, 6 months later, the wounds from that day had begun to heal, both literally and figuratively. The wall had been repaired. Westlake had stabilized under my direct leadership. And Blake had eventually accepted the settlement terms Catherine had negotiated with Hawkins. Those terms had been surprisingly generous by legal standards, though Blake considered them humiliating. He received a one-time payment of $5 million, fair, compensation for his 12 years of service as CEO, though not the fortune he had anticipated from selling his company. The prenuptial agreement's adultery clause had invalidated his claims to our shared assets, though I had allowed him to keep selected personal items and the watch collection he valued so highly. Most painfully for Blake, the settlement included a non-disparagement clause and required his formal acknowledgement of Westlake's actual ownership structure. The alternative Catherine had presented was litigation that would have publicly exposed not just his affair, but the extent of his fundamental misunderstanding about the company he claimed to have built. A soft knock interrupted my reflections. Laura entered, carrying a folder of documents requiring my signature. "The year-end projections are finalized," she reported, placing them on my desk. "We're tracking 28% above last year, even with the organizational changes. And the Morton implementation? Proceeding exactly on schedule." James called personally to express his satisfaction with the transition. "He mentioned he'd always expected you would eventually take a more visible role in leadership." I smiled slightly. "James has always seen more than most people realize." Laura hesitated before adding, "Blake's new consulting firm issued their launch announcement today. Thought you might want to know." I nodded, having already seen the press release. Blake had established a small strategic advisory practice focusing on healthcare technology, a niche that deliberately avoided direct competition with Westlake. The announcement had been factual and forward-looking, with no reference to his previous role. The non-disparagement clause was serving its purpose. Amber went with him, Laura added, unable to disguise her disapproval. As expected. This development didn't surprise me. Amber had resigned from Westlake the week after the revelation, her departure handled professionally despite the circumstances. Whatever her original calculations in becoming involved with Blake, she had chosen to remain with him through his professional disgrace. Perhaps that reflected genuine feeling rather than opportunism. I chose to believe the better interpretation, one of the small mercies I'd granted myself in the aftermath. "The executive meeting is in 10 minutes, Laura reminded me. "Final agenda item is the Meridian integration timeline." "Thank you. I'll be right there." After Laura departed, I took a moment to reflect on how thoroughly Westlake had transformed under my direct leadership. The Meridian acquisition, the cybersecurity firm I had purchased separately as a planned anniversary gift for Blake, had proceeded as intended, though with a very different emotional context. The integration was now enhancing Westlake's service offerings in precisely the ways I had envisioned, though Blake would never realize this represented yet another strategic contribution he had mistakenly believed was his own vision. The company culture had evolved as well. I had made my expectations clear from the beginning. Westlake would operate with integrity, transparency, and respect at all levels. The whispered gossip and uncomfortable dynamics surrounding Blake and Amber's relationship had dissipated, replaced by a renewed focus on professional excellence. Surprisingly, most employees had adapted quickly to my leadership. Many seemed relieved by the clarity and consistency I brought to the organization. A few of Blake's most loyal supporters had chosen to leave, but the core team remained intact and committed to Westlake's continued success. Most painfully for Blake, the settlement included a non-disparagement clause and required his formal acknowledgement of Westlake's actual ownership structure. The alternative Catherine had presented was litigation that would have publicly exposed not just his affair, but the extent of his fundamental misunderstanding about the company he claimed to have built. A soft knock interrupted my reflections. Laura entered, carrying a folder of documents requiring my signature. "The year-end projections are finalized," she reported, placing them on my desk. "We're tracking 28% above last year, even with the organizational changes. And the Morton implementation? Proceeding. Exactly on schedule." James called personally to express his satisfaction with the transition. "He mentioned he'd always expected you would eventually take a more visible role in leadership." I smiled slightly. "James has always seen more than most people realize." Laura hesitated before adding, "Blake's new consulting firm issued their launch announcement today. Thought you might want to know." I nodded, having already seen the press release. Blake had established a small strategic advisory practice focusing on healthcare technology, a niche that deliberately avoided direct competition with Westlake. The announcement had been factual and forward-looking, with no reference to his previous role. The non-disparagement clause was serving its purpose. "Amber went with him," Laura added, unable to disguise her disapproval. As expected. This development didn't surprise me. Amber had resigned from Westlake the week after the revelation, her departure handled professionally despite the circumstances. Whatever her original calculations in becoming involved with Blake, she had chosen to remain with him through his professional disgrace. Perhaps that reflected genuine feeling rather than opportunism. I chose to believe the better interpretation, one of the small mercies I'd granted myself in the aftermath. "The executive meeting is in 10 minutes, Laura reminded me. "Final agenda item is the Meridian integration timeline." "Thank you. I'll be right there." After Laura departed, I took a moment to reflect on how thoroughly Westlake had transformed under my direct leadership. The Meridian acquisition, the cybersecurity firm I had purchased separately as a planned anniversary gift for Blake, had proceeded as intended, though with a very different emotional context. The integration was now enhancing Westlake's service offerings in precisely the ways I had envisioned, though Blake would never realize this represented yet another strategic contribution he had mistakenly believed was his own vision. The company. Culture had evolved as well. I had made my expectations clear from the beginning. Westlake would operate with integrity, transparency, and respect at all levels. The whispered gossip and uncomfortable dynamics surrounding Blake and Amber's relationship had dissipated, replaced by a renewed focus on professional excellence. Surprisingly, most employees had adapted quickly to my leadership. Many seemed relieved by the clarity and consistency I brought to the organization. A few of Blake's most loyal supporters had chosen to leave, but the core team remained intact and committed to Westlake's continued success. I gathered my materials for the executive meeting, pausing briefly at the photo I now kept on my desk, not of Blake, but of my grandfather, William Calloway, whose business wisdom had shaped my approach since childhood. Structures outlast personalities, he had often reminded me. Build foundations strong enough to withstand any individual's departure. The wisdom of that guidance had never been more evident than during the past 6 months. As I walked to the conference room, Rebecca Chen fell into step beside me. "The organizational climate survey results are extremely positive," she reported, "particularly the metrics on leadership transparency and professional development opportunities. Any areas of concern? Some lingering questions about long-term strategic direction, natural after a significant leadership transition." I nodded, unsurprised. "We'll address that explicitly in the January all-hands meeting. People need to understand that while leadership has changed, our fundamental commitment to excellence remains consistent." The executive meeting proceeded efficiently, each department head reporting progress on key initiatives. When we reached the Meridian integration discussion, I found myself reflecting on how different this meeting felt from those Blake had conducted. Less performance, more substance, fewer pronouncements, more collaborative problem-solving. "Savannah," Thomas Reynolds, our Chief Technology Officer, concluded, "We've established the technical integration framework, but cultural alignment remains challenging. Meridian's team operates with different methodologies than our historical approach. Different doesn't mean incompatible, I noted. Their security-first perspective complements our user experience focus. The tension between those priorities creates better solutions when properly managed. The team nodded, accepting the perspective. This represented another subtle shift from Blake's leadership, acknowledging that differences could create value, rather than obstacles when approached with the right mindset. After the meeting concluded, I returned to my office to find Catherine waiting, elegant as always in a tailored suit that projected quiet authority. "The final property transfer documents are ready for your signature," she announced without preamble. "Blake has executed his portion already." I reviewed the papers, which formalized the transfer of our shared home to my sole ownership. Blake had initially fought for the property despite its clear status as my separate asset under the prenuptial agreement. His eventual capitulation on this point had marked the beginning of his acceptance of the new reality. "Have you heard from Eleanor lately?" Catherine asked as I signed the documents. "We had dinner last week," I confirmed. "She's enjoying retirement, though she mentioned missing the intellectual challenges of the bench. She provided crucial stability that day," Catherine observed. "Blake might have created a much more challenging situation without her presence." I nodded in agreement. Eleanor's calm authority had been instrumental in preventing Blake's emotional collapse from derailing the carefully orchestrated transition. After Catherine departed with the signed documents, I received an unexpected call from James Morton. "Savannah," he greeted warmly. "I've been meaning to reach out directly. The implementation team reports excellent progress, but I wanted to check in personally." "Everything is proceeding as planned," I assured him. "The technical challenges have been minimal, and the relationship management has been seamless despite the leadership transition." "That's precisely why I called," Morton replied. "The transition has been remarkably smooth from our perspective. In my experience, organizational changes of this magnitude typically create significant disruption. You've managed to avoid that entirely." "Careful planning makes most disruptions preventable," I noted. "Indeed." Morton paused briefly. "I ran into Blake yesterday at the Chicago Executive Forum. He seems diminished somehow, maintaining professional composure, but fundamentally changed." I wasn't surprised by this assessment. Blake's identity had been so thoroughly intertwined with his perception of himself as Westlake's founder and visionary leader that its loss had inevitably transformed him. "Success rebuilds itself in new forms," I replied diplomatically. "I'm sure he'll establish value in his new venture." "Gracious as always," Morton observed. "Not everyone would extend such consideration after what transpired." The conversation turned to business matters, but Morton's observation lingered after we concluded the call. Was it grace that motivated my restrained approach to Blake's defeat, or something else? The question deserved honest reflection. That evening, I left work earlier than usual and drove not home, but to my childhood residence in the historic Kenwood neighborhood. My parents had long since relocated to Arizona, but I had maintained the property, finding comfort in its familiar spaces during periods of transition. The house stood peaceful in the winter twilight, its Victorian architecture softened by fresh snow. Inside, I bypassed the formal rooms and went directly to my father's study, a wood-paneled sanctuary that remained exactly as it had been during my childhood. I settled into the leather chair where my father had taught me the principles of business strategy through marathon chess games that trained me to think several moves ahead. The lessons had served me well, culminating in the elaborate endgame I had orchestrated with Blake. Yet victory had brought more complex emotions than I had anticipated. Not regret, exactly. Blake's betrayal had warranted a consequential response. But a certain melancholy for what had been lost. 12 years of shared life, dissolved not just by his infidelity, but by the fundamental misunderstanding at the core of our relationship. Has Blake ever truly known me? Had I allowed him to? The carefully constructed separation between my support role and my actual ownership of Westlake had served strategic purposes, but it had also created distance that pervaded our marriage in ways I hadn't fully recognized. Until recently. My phone chimed with a text message from Dr. Taylor Matthews, the therapist I had begun seeing 3 months after the revelation. Our weekly sessions had become an unexpected source of clarity during the rebuilding process. Don't forget to acknowledge today's anniversary. 6 months of authentic leadership, both professionally and personally. Progress deserves recognition. The reminder was characteristic of Taylor's approach. Gentle insistence on celebrating milestones in the journey toward what she called integrated authenticity. The concept had initially struck me as psychotherapy jargon, but had gradually revealed its practical wisdom. There was profound liberation in no longer compartmentalizing aspects of my identity, no longer moderating my capabilities to maintain someone else's illusion of control. At Westlake, I now led openly, bringing my full strategic capabilities and vision to the role without concealing my contributions. In my personal life, I had begun rebuilding relationships on foundations of genuine connection, rather than carefully calculated presentation. The process hadn't been seamless. Decades of habitual self-editing didn't dissolve overnight. But each authentic interaction, each decision made from integrated values rather than strategic calculation, strengthened new patterns that felt increasingly natural. As twilight deepened outside the study windows, I found myself contemplating what came next. The immediate challenges had been addressed. Westlake was thriving under my leadership. The divorce was finalized. My financial and legal positions were secure. The scaffolding of crisis management could now be dismantled, revealing the open question of what I truly wanted to build in this unexpected new chapter. Elizabeth Chen, my closest friend since college, and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's principal, cellist, had posed the question directly during our dinner last week. For 15 years, your life was structured around Blake and the company he thought was his, she had observed. Now, you've reclaimed your company. But have you reclaimed yourself yet? What does Savannah want for Savannah? The question had lingered, unanswered, but increasingly insistent. What did I want beyond the restoration of what had been taken? What aspirations had I set aside during the years of supporting Blake's illusions? What new possibilities might emerge now that I was freed from that constraint? The answers weren't immediately clear, but the questions themselves represented progress. 6 months ago, I had been entirely focused on executing the perfect strategic response to Blake's betrayal. Now, I could begin imagining beyond that narrow framework, considering possibilities that had nothing to do with responding to someone else's actions. My phone rang again. Martin Walsh, my financial advisor, calling with updates on year-end investment performance. The conversation was brief but satisfying, confirming that my portfolio had outperformed market benchmarks substantially. As we concluded the call, Martin added a personal note. Your grandfather would be proud, Savannah, not just of the financial results, but of how you've handled this entire situation. William always believed that true success meant maintaining your principles, even when others abandoned theirs. The observation brought unexpected emotion, a reminder that while Blake had failed to see or appreciate my true capabilities, others had recognized them all along. My grandfather's confidence in me had never wavered, nor had the support of friends like Elizabeth and mentors like Eleanor. I left my childhood home with growing clarity about the path forward. The past 6 months had been necessarily focused on response and restoration, addressing Blake's betrayal, stabilizing Westlake, finalizing the divorce. The next chapter would be about creation and possibility, building something new from the foundation of hard-won wisdom. Driving back to my home, no longer our home, but truly mine, I felt a sense of anticipation that had been absent in recent months. The winter night sparkled with possibilities as endless as the stars visible beyond the city lights. Blake had wanted a divorce to be with his mistress, not knowing I owned his business. The revelation had destroyed the life he thought he was building and the future he had planned with Amber. Justice had been served, thoroughly and irreversibly. But the most powerful revelation had been my own, discovering that beyond the satisfaction of strategic victory lay the greater fulfillment of authentic self-expression. The company was mine, yes. But more importantly, my life was finally and completely my own. That was the true triumph, not over Blake, but over the limitations I had accepted to maintain his illusions. Those constraints were gone now, dissolved along with the marriage that had housed them. What remained was possibility, pure, unscripted, and mine to define. As I pulled into my driveway, holiday lights twinkled along the roofline, a decorative touch I had added this year, breaking from the more restrained aesthetic Blake had preferred. The small change symbolized larger transformations still unfolding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges at Westlake, new opportunities to build on the foundation I had established. But tonight belonged to a quiet celebration of how far I had come. Not just in executing perfect justice against betrayal, but in reclaiming the authentic self that had been partially obscured during my years with Blake. The path ahead remained unwritten, a blank page awaiting the story I would choose to create. For the first time in longer than I could remember, that uncertainty felt not like a strategic problem to solve, but like a gift to be treasured. Blake had lost everything he valued because he failed to understand who I truly was. I had gained something far more precious through the same revelation, the freedom to discover what I might become when no longer defined by someone else's limited perception. That was a future worth building, one authentic choice at a time. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.